What's up, guys? Welcome back to MMA Meeting. Let's Talk with the Weasle podcast, where we talk all things MMA. Hope you guys have an amazing day. Happy holidays. Hope you have a great time with the family, man. Great time off of work. You know, you guys deserve it. Just like we all deserve a great UFC 300 card. And I don't know how it's looking. I don't know what these few fights that got announced, if UFC 300 is going to stack up to 299. I saw some of the comments around 299. Obviously, it's the most stacked of the first quarter so far. After looking at some of the comments, I'm thinking I might be a little bit out of the loop on who the general fans believe is exciting. And not only that, even some of the fights that Dana announced for 300, a lot of the fans don't seem too excited about a lot of this. Jiri Prochazka is going to fight Aleksandar Rakic, and I think that's an excellent fight, but it looks like a lot of the fans want that on the prelims. For a guy who was headlining pay-per-views as a champion and a title contender to go on the prelims of 300, a very exciting fighter in his own right. A lot of the hardcore fans love Jiri Prochazka. I don't know if you could put a guy like that on the prelims. But then again, maybe a lot of the fans don't think he's that exciting or like him too much. And then for 299, it seems like a lot of fans don't think that card is necessarily that stacked. But then again, most people that watch videos and stuff actually don't comment. So I don't know exactly how many people don't think these cards are that great. But I'm actually very interested to see how good you think these cards actually are, right? So when we look at 297, you got Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis, Raquel Pennington versus Mayra Bueno Silva. I understand people don't care about that fight too much. Neil Magny versus Mike Malott, Arnold Allen versus Mavsar Evloev, Dominic Reyes versus Carlos Olberg, Bracatona versus Garrett Armfield, Chris Curtis versus Marc-Andre Barriault, Charles Jourdain versus Sean Woodson, Siri Saidi versus Ramon Tavares, Jillian Robertson versus Polyana Viana, Johan Lanus versus Sam Patterson, Jasmine versus Priscilla Cachoeira, Malcolm Gordon versus Jimmy Flick. This card I would say is pretty decent. There's some good fights throughout. Not necessarily like the most stacked, but a pretty good starter for the year. Then 298, which is, I think, more stacked than that. You have Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilya Topuria, Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa. They need a backup fighter for that. We don't know if Costa's going to show up again. He pulls out of so many fights, it's insane. Jeff Neal versus Ian Gary got moved from 299 to 298. Ian Gary probably didn't want to share a car with Kevin Holland and ask for the move. Merab Dvalishvili versus Henry Cejudo, Tai Tuivasa versus Marcin Tybura, Tatiana Suarez versus Amanda Lemos, Anthony Hernandez versus Ikram Aliskerov, Marcos Rogero de Lima versus Justin Tafa, Zhang Ming Yang versus Bredson Ribeiro, Yusaku Kinoshita versus Daniel Barlow, Andrea Lee versus Miranda Maverick, Rinya Nakamura versus Brady Highstand, Oban Elliott versus the GOAT Valentin Woodburn. This card is looking very, very nice, and I will break down the fights. I'll make a video on this card. This is looking pretty stacked in my opinion. I think this card looks stacked. And then 299, you got Sean O'Malley versus Chito, Gilbert Burns versus Jack Della Maddalena, Kevin Holland versus Michael Page, Curtis Blaze versus Jelson Almeida, Caitlin Chukagian versus Macy Barber, Mateusz Gamrot versus RDA, Pietro Yan versus Song Yadong, Pedro Munoz versus Kyler Phillips, Lauren Murphy versus Corrine Silva, CJ Vergara versus Asu Almabayev. I don't know, man. I think this card is crazy. There's only like 2 fights that you can say are kind of lackluster, and every single other fight isn't. Every single other fight is worth watching. And when do you get pay-per-views even like that? When do you get pay-per-views when there's like 8 fights that are somewhat interesting or exciting to watch? You very rarely get something like that. So that's why I do think this card is stacked compared to the average pay-per-view card. So in my opinion, I got 299 as the most stacked so far, then 298, then 297. And I don't know who they're going to put on 300. That leads right into what Alex Pereira posted on his Instagram. Alex Pereira's post needed to be deciphered because it's quite confusing. So he posted 30 plus 300 equals 3. What I got out of it was 30 is pointing to his next opponent. The reason why it might be Tom Aspinall is because he's 30 years old. That's what I got out of it. 300, obviously the fight at UFC 300, and then equals 3 means equal 3 titles. So I fight Tom Aspinall at UFC 300, and the result will be I become a 3-division champion. I'm not gonna lie. If that's the announcement, if that's that super fight that Dana talked about, I know Pereira is in a huge disadvantage against a guy like Aspinall, and for many different factors. He's much smaller, he's way worse on the ground, he could get knocked out. The way he leans away from punches against a big guy like that who will blitz him down with the 1-2. That fight could be disastrous for Alex Pereira in many different ways, but if he were to pull that off, if Pereira would be able to beat Tom Aspinall and become the first ever 3-division champion, getting all 3 belts while only being in the UFC for 2.5 years, his 8th UFC fight, it would have to be impossible for anybody to break that record. Sometimes it takes a fighter 8 fights to get a first title shot. This guy would get his 3rd belt in 8 fights. Huge if, though. That's like the biggest of all ifs, to beat Tom Aspinall. And speaking of Tom Aspinall, he did mention something about Jon Jones's resume. It's a thing that a lot of fans have been questioning for a very long time. He brought up that Jones' legacy was mostly beating middleweights. If you look at his competition, there's a load of fighters that he went up against that came up from middleweight or went to middleweight soon after they fought him. He didn't dive too deep as to, if that discredits Jones and stuff like that, but the fact that he did bring it up means that he might be taking a shot at Jones's resume. And the longer the time goes, the more fans are also seeing the same thing. When you look at Lyoto, Rashad, Vitor, Chael Sonnen, Anthony Smith, Thiago Santos, all these guys fought at middleweight. I think Anthony Smith was always a light heavyweight that just cut way too much, kind of like Sean Strickland fighting at welterweight. He was a middleweight cutting too much. And then you have Shogun, who was like the same size as the Vitors, the Rashads, the Lyotos, etc., right? I think he even mentioned back in the day that he could have fought at middleweight, but he chose not to. So yes, there were a lot of guys that Jones fought that did fight or could fight at middleweight, especially the vast majority of that quote-unquote murderer's row that he went through when he became champion. This is absolutely a fact. And also, Rampage was like the only guy back then that was a real light heavyweight, and Jones easily beat him. But then when Jones went up against actual light heavyweights that weren't older, he had a much harder time instantly. The first light heavyweight that was his generation was Gustafsson, right? That was the first guy he fought, and look how close that fight was. Then he fought Glover, which I'm thinking the Glover win may be like top 2 greatest wins of his career, especially knowing where Glover went to. That win has aged like fine wine. The first DC win was a great one as well. Those 2 wins, Glover and DC won, were probably the best wins of his career considering who he beat. Some people say, what about Ciryl Gane? I don't know, man, because Ciryl Gane's wrestling was completely untested for a long time until he fought Ngannou. Ngannou exposed his wrestling. Then Jones absolutely destroyed him in that aspect. So stylistically, I won't say that Gane rivals these wins. He's a big guy. He was a heavyweight. That was Jones' first time going up. I understand that's why it was such a big win for Jones, and it was his fastest win of his UFC career. But regarding Glover and DC, these guys are well-rounded, champions with title defenses. They're legends, like they've done a lot in their careers, beat some great competition as well. I think those 2 wins are his greatest of his entire career. All the other fights were not necessarily too impressive. We're not counting DC2 because it was a no contest. He did win the fight, but that's when he got popped for Turinabol. How did you even get Turinabol in your system? That's a 1960s German steroid that was discontinued in the 90s. Where did he get that? But yeah, he popped for Turinabol from that fight. That's why it was a no contest. That's why there's a huge asterisk next to that win. You look at Ovince St. Preux, you look at Anthony Smith, Thiago Santos, and Dominic Reyes, none of these wins were necessarily impressive. In fact, most people believe that he lost to Dominic Reyes, and that quote-unquote win over Reyes has aged like you left milk out in the sun for a month. Absolute spoiled milk. Reyes is on the verge of getting cut from the UFC. And that's the guy that arguably beat Jon Jones, that Jones even mentally was questioning and doubting himself in the fight because he was losing. Thiago Santos fought very well with Jones, even while injuring himself, pretty much standing on no knees. The Smith and OSP wins were clear wins, of course, but not necessarily impressive, not what you're used to seeing from Jon Jones. Now, you can look at anybody's resume as a devil's advocate, right? You can always poke holes at everybody's records, but it does seem like Jon Jones does get it more than anybody else, whether the criticism about his legacy are true or not. But I'm definitely seeing a lot more fans looking at it this way. What I'm saying about Jon Jones' resume is what a lot of hardcore fans see from Jones' resume as well. But if you ask for my opinion, I can't count him as the GOAT just because of the PEDs. He's popped way too many times for me to consider him. But if you were to include PEDs, then he's the GOAT, right? He's the greatest of all time. But if anybody wants to bring up GSP or DJ, I would not argue against that. So Tom Aspinall seems to think a very similar kind of thing and may believe that Jones' record is not necessarily as impressive as it's led to believe. And another thing that the fans think is not too impressive are some of these fights that Dana talked about yesterday. So Dana announced the Robert Whittaker Paulo Costa fight. Then he also announced Brian Ortega versus Yair Rodriguez 2 in Mexico City. So it's going to be in Rodriguez's home and cast all doubts of what happened in that first fight, right? There's a lot of A lot of people thinking that the first fight ended because of pure luck, and we're going to see this time. Ortega's not fought in a very long time. I still think Rodriguez does have the advantage going into it. The fact that he put Ortega in an armbar by itself when the fight hit the ground is already something to be concerned about for Ortega, because in the striking, Rodriguez should be able to take over. Aaron Blanchfield versus Menon Fiorot got announced, which means maybe Alexa Grasso fights Valentina Shevchenko again. This is what I thought was going to happen. I think it was pretty logical to have Blanchfield fight Fiorot because both these fighters deserve a title shot, so might as well just have them fight each other. Now, you could have Alexa Grasso versus Zhang Weili. That's a pretty big fight, but the thing about Zhang Weili is she has her next opponent. It's Yan Xiaonan. And then if Suarez beats Lemos, then you got your next contender. So it's a bit of an issue with the lineup at 115. You got an order of contenders here, and if you're going to throw Zhang Weili at flyweight, it could hold things up in that division. So I can see Grasso vs. Shevchenko 3, finally end that rivalry, have Zhang Weili fight Yan Xiaonan, and then depending on who wins these fights, then maybe you could do a super fight down the road. And I do believe that Zhang Weili actually does very well against both Grasso and Shevchenko. I've held the opinion for a long time that Shevchenko's too much for Zhang Weili. After what Grasso was able to expose of Valentina, I think Weili actually has a pretty good chance against her as well. But Blanchfield vs. Fiorot is a good fight. Blanchfield's got to take the fight to the ground, but Fiorot is strong. She can be quite difficult to handle in the clinch. She should be the better striker of the two. It's going to be interesting how that fight goes. Then we have Jiri Prochazka versus Aleksandar Rakic at UFC 300. This is a good fight, man. Rakic has been out for quite a long time. Jiri wants to get busy. He wants to get right back in there after losing to Pereira. If Rakic comes in there ring rusted, I think Jiri is absolutely going to beat him and probably knock him out. If he's not, I think the leg kicks from far range could be a big problem. And if Jiri wants to make his way in close, throw those darting punches at him, if Rakic is able to slip those, he is going to clinch up with him, put him up against the fence, hold him there, and try to take him to the ground. So Jiri has to be very aware of his range in this fight. He cannot be too close, and he cannot be too far away. He's got to be in that mid-range and keep the fight there at all times. Because from far range, Rakic does way too much damage. Those kicks are crazy. And then in close range, he kind of just stalls you out sometimes. Bo Nickel versus Cody Brundage got announced. This is a good fight for Bo Nickel against these fighters that aren't high level. And he's going to be on the prelims, which is a good thing. I know he said he wants to be on the main card, but if UFC 300 is going to be that stacked, Bo Nickel should absolutely be on the prelims. And he is the prospect that they want to build up, so they have to have him on this card. And then Aljamain Sterling versus Calvin Kattar. Aljamain is actually going up to 145, and it's not against Max Holloway. Why against Calvin Kattar and not Max? The only thing I could think of is Max may be too big of a step up, right, for his first fight at 145. We got to really see how good he competes up there. If he could get past Kattar, then he's going to be potentially a top 5 145er. Then we know that Aljo can absolutely compete with the best at 145. And the fact that these two are fighting each other leads me to believe that either Max is fighting Justin Gaethje, and I hope for Max's sake that does not happen. He might actually get finished in that fight. That is way too dangerous of an opponent, way too big of an opponent for him right now. Justin would do what Dustin did to him, but like 10 times worse because of the power difference and how much more damage Max has taken ever since that Dustin fight. And Dustin was rocking him, man. Imagine what Gaethje's gonna do. It's harder. But Max could fight Josh Emmett. Coming off potentially the knockout of the year is a pretty good position to be in to go up against Max. And the crazy thing is, the next highest ranked available opponent for Max Holloway is Josh Emmett. So he's never fought him before. Emmett's number 6. Max is number 1. I would like to see that fight more than the Gaethje fight. But then again, if anybody can knock Max out in the featherweight division, it is Josh Emmett. He's the most powerful guy ever in that division. The guy has 12 knockdowns in 14 UFC fights. Do you know how insanely high that rate is? I haven't done the numbers for the other fighters, but that might be the highest knockdown rate per fight in UFC history. Unless Francis Ngannou has it. And if Francis has it, he's a heavyweight. Josh Emmett is a featherweight. Even Anderson Silva and Jeremy Stevens don't have as high of a knockdown rate as Josh Emmett does. And that knockout against Bryce Mitchell has done Josh Emmett wonders, man. Everybody's talking about him in good light now. It seems like everybody respects him on another level now. Because before, he used to get some flack from the fans sometimes. Not necessarily because they think he's a bad fighter or something, but kind of like the positions he always gets put in. Everybody thought that Calvin Kattar was robbed against him. He fought for the interim title against Yair Rodriguez and got schooled. So there was a lot of flack coming Josh Emmett's way, but then this knockout just gave him so much respect from the fan base. It was one of the most viral things to happen for UFC 296. I think the most viral thing might have been the Strickland and Dricus brawl in the crowd, and then maybe the backlash of Colby Covington. After that may have been the Josh Emmett knockout, because that was going all over the place, man. And what about welterweight? If you guys actually think about like throughout welterweight's history in the UFC, most of the champions have been somewhat boring to a certain level, you know? So Leon Edwards is getting some flack for being a boring champion. I think that knockout against Usman misdirected a lot of people to think that he's some kind of knockout artist or he's some kind of exciting striker when he never was like that. Most of his career was what you're seeing now. This is who Leon Edwards is. He's a tactical, technical striker. Sometimes derps and just like gets a brain fart, does something that gets him rocked or gets him in a bad position. He'll fight so intelligently and then make some horrible mistakes in a fight out of nowhere. Throwing a check hook that wide against Diaz, who was known for the 1-2, or him wrestling with Colby when he shouldn't have. Throwing the step and elbow and nearly getting finished for it against Brian Barberena. There are times where Leon looks like a savant out there, but then there's like a few rare moments where he will do something and it makes you think, wait, how did this guy become champion? But usually he's a very technical fighter and will do enough to win a fight. You could draw parallels to Israel Adesanya, except I would say Adesanya has more killer instinct. He will go for the finish more than Leon will. And he's a much bigger like buzzsaw of a counter striker. If you run into Adesanya, your ass gonna get knocked out. At least there's something to that, right? Most fighters don't want to engage Adesanya because of how quickly he can knock you out for it. Leon is not necessarily the same thing. In fact, rushing Leon is not nearly as dangerous as a lot of people believe it is. And Colby Covington throwing out those weird flying knees and some of those winging punches without Leon even countering him for many of those showed that. If he did that against someone like Adesanya, Colby would have gotten countered and hurt. But it's not just Leon. This is what I wanted to talk about. If you think Leon Edwards is boring, a lot of the champions of the welterweight division have been boring as well. As great as GSP was, a lot of his fights were not that entertaining. A great technician, very high fight IQ, one of the greatest fighters of all time, but he wasn't that exciting. And whenever you hear like MMA personalities not include GSP as one of the greatest fighters, it's mostly because the guy wasn't that exciting. And GSP held that belt longer than anybody else. He was a champion for so long of the welterweight's history. And then you had Tyron Woodley, who was also one of the longest reigning welterweight champions. His fights were boring too. His fight against Damian Maia, against Wonderboy. Some of Matt Hughes' fights were boring back in the day. I wouldn't say he's as lackluster as GSP or Tyron Woodley or Leon Edwards, but he did have some of those as well. Johnny Hendricks tried to make the second Robbie Lawler fight boring. He didn't want that same smoke from the first fight, so he went a different direction and tried to stall out Robbie Lawler for so long. And then you had Robbie Lawler, right? Then you have one of the most exciting champions in UFC history from welterweight. You have Robbie, you had Kamaru Usman. Usman was way more boring as a contender before he won the belt. When he became champ, he did the reverse of what so many other fighters do, right? He became actually exciting to watch. And a lot of people miss Kamaru Usman as a champion now. Looking at what's going on, looking at the fights you're getting, a lot of people seem to miss what Kamaru Usman brought to the table. Knocking out Gilbert Burns the way he did. The crazy wars with Colby Covington. Amazing fights between them two. The knockout against Jorge Masvidal. The only boring fight from Kamaru Usman when he was a champion was the first Jorge fight. That one was not too fun to watch, and it might have been because it was a short notice replacement, and he went to his wrestling, right? So to make things safe and not test himself too much on the feet with Jorge, he went to the area that he knew he had over Jorge. Right? For Kamaru Usman to strike with Jorge Masvidal, he needs a game plan. He needs to prepare for it. He can't just go out there and strike with him without understanding Jorge's game. So he went the path of least resistance and did what he had to do against a short notice fighter. Then you saw what happened in the second fight. Definitely struck with him and definitely knocked him out. I would say throughout welterweight's history, obviously Robbie Lawler was number one, the funnest champion. Then Kamaru Usman, then Matt Hughes. With Leon and GSP, you could kind of exchange the two. Then either GSP or Tyron Woodley, one of the two. The thing about Woodley is, him winning the belt by first round knockout against Robbie Lawler was crazy. How fast he finished Darren Till, dropping him and then submitting him, was pretty exciting as well. The first Wonderboy fight had moments of excitement. Even the end of the second fight, where Woodley almost finished him, dropped him twice, was pretty crazy, but the vast majority of those fights were not that fun to watch. The second fight was like 4 rounds of nothing happening. The first fight had more moments, but the majority of that fight was not too entertaining, right? Remember when Woodley went for the guillotine on Stephen Thompson and Wonderboy was just throwing punches? The crowd was going crazy, right? You had some good moments. You have the knockdowns against Wonderboy in the first fight. You had the takedown in the first round. There were more moments in the first fight. But then you do have the Damian Maia fight, right? Tyron Woodley versus Damian Maia was like probably the most boring welterweight title fight in history. if Leon versus Colby wasn't it. So Tyron Woodley and GSP I would think are somewhat equivalent in terms of pure entertainment. And then last, I would have Leon Edwards. He has that knockout against Usman, but the majority of that was not too fun to watch. For like 3.5 rounds, that fight was not entertaining. It was the takedown from Leon in the first round, got his back. That was fun to watch. And then the knockout at the end. The second Usman fight, I think it was a pretty average fight in terms of entertainment. Wasn't anything too crazy. Nothing much happened. Then you have the Colby fight, which was like one of the worst welterweight title fights in history. So yeah, I would put GSP above Leon, and I would have Leon as right now the most boring, and hopefully in the future, Leon goes out there and proves how exciting of a fighter he is. Hopefully he can get some good knockouts, good performances, fun stuff out there, but I have a feeling he won't. He's been fighting this kind of way for a long time, and I don't see him changing it as he's winning doing this. And then we go to Jor Rogan. So Jor Rogan came out and said that fighters outside the UFC are wasting their careers going elsewhere as nobody's watching them. Now, I agree with Jor Rogan for the potential stars, for potential champions, like the highest level fighters. They should be in the UFC. But the guys that can't really make it too far in the UFC, I think their better places are elsewhere, like PFL and stuff, like Impa Kazanage. That guy will most likely never become UFC champion, but now he's a millionaire because he went to the PFL. He found a place with lesser competition, and they're willing to pay you to win these tournaments. If you're good enough to beat the PFL's best, while not being able to beat the UFC's best, you probably should be going to the PFL or One Championship or these other organizations, right? Because they can make more money elsewhere. The way the UFC is designed, they are meant to have the best fighters in the world, right? Because the champions of the UFC, the stars of the UFC are making more money than anybody else. So I agree with Joe Rogan for certain fighters, and then I disagree with Joe Rogan when it comes to lower level fighters. And with that, let's go right to the questions. So I did post for questions a few hours ago. I don't know if this is better because I know the longer I wait out after posting for questions, I know the wider the margins are going to be in between likes. So it's going to be a lot harder for people to get their questions in there. If you're getting your questions in there a day after people already posted, your question's probably not going to get read. Even if it's a very good question, you know. I see some of these questions you guys post, like they're very good, but they're posted so much later that people just don't see them. So I'll see if this is a better way. You guys leave in the comments below if you guys like me to get to the questions sooner. So first question by the members, we got Sam Wise Gamgee. Hi Weasle. With UFC 296 now a done deal, given Leon's physicality, how do you see him against Islam at 170? Not in Abu Dhabi. Also, you see an upcoming decline in Colby's performance given his lackluster comeback title shot. Greetings, man. Thanks for the consistency in your podcast releases lately. No problem, man. Thank you so much. I'm trying to give you guys podcasts at least once a week. I see your guys' feedback, so I'll do my best to make those as frequent as possible. But there are some podcasts I'm working on in the next couple weeks. They should be done by then. I'm cooking up some cool stuff for you guys. So Leon versus Islam at 170. I've been talking about this fight with some of my friends lately, and so technically and just skills, Islam I think is better than Leon. I think he could do some stuff in the stand-up. I think people will underestimate Islam's boxing against Leon. He is a southpaw, which leaves that 1-2 opening as Leon is trying to counter him with the right hook, which he does against literally every southpaw. I don't know why he does that against every southpaw, but he continues to do it. Those are like those derp moments I'm talking about. And Islam is faster than Leon. He could get that 1-2 in there, and whether or not he connects, he can always shoot under afterward. Leon, of course, is the better striker overall. He should get the better of Islam as long as it stays on the feet, but Islam could find his moments to get in and transition some of those punches to takedowns. Islam has pretty decent footwork. He has good kicks himself. He could back up Leon off of those, pressure him up against the fence, and that is the worst place for Leon to be against someone like Islam Makhachev. But Leon is pretty good at fighting off the hands. He should be able to make his way back up to the feet, especially knowing that he is bigger. That's where the physicality is going to kick in. I think even how big Leon is, Islam will still take him to the ground. And Islam is the most dangerous guy Leon's ever fought on the ground. Usman doesn't come close. There is Gunnar Nelson, right? Nelson is pretty dangerous at what he does. He's a very good back taker, but I think Islam is on a whole different level. The thing that he beats Gunnar Nelson in completely is control. I think for Leon to win this fight, he has to knock him out. I can't see Leon beating Islam in a decision, especially with how many tools Islam can work with at a very high level. We can't look at Islam as just some kind of mediocre striker anymore. Islam is a high-level striker. He just is. To do what he did against Volkanovski, the fact that he was able to compete with him on the stand-up in the first fight and then knock him out convincingly in the second fight, the fact that he was able to drop Charles Oliveira the way he did. Islam's had some very high-level moments in striking Nobody can underestimate him in that department anymore, especially Leon should not. Leon's got to respect everything Islam does. And I think regardless, with that respect or not, I see Islam beating Leon Edwards. It's very hard to beat this guy at this point. I mean, he's pound for pound number one for a reason. And not just pound for pound number one, there's like no argument against him besides John Jones. It's Jones and Islam at number 1 and 2. Volkanovski's kind of there. But after the way he lost in the second fight, I think that just throws all arguments out the window for that. So there's quite a bit of gap after Jones and Islam. After that is Volkanovski. There's quite a big gap between Volkanovski and Leon. I mean, can you argue that Leon is closer to number 5 than he is to number 3? Would he be closer to Pereira than he is to Volkanovski? So yeah, I do think that Islam should be able to beat Leon Edwards, even considering Leon's physicality. Islam is not even a small guy, right? This guy is a big 155er. There's a reason why he's talking about going up to 170, and it's not even been his first time. And the guy wrestles with middleweights. In fact, the people in the training room say that Islam is the best grappler in their gym. That even includes Khabib. They say Khabib's the best fighter in their gym. Khabib's never lost a round. But when it comes to just grappling, I think Josh Thompson said it, that Islam is a better grappler than Khabib is. And he's the only guy that's able to test Khabib in that area. And we know Khabib grapples with Luke Rockhold. Regardless of what you want to say with Luke Rockhold as a complete MMA fighter, as a striker, with his chin and all that stuff, Luke Rockhold has always been very high level on the ground. Luke Rockhold is one of the most dangerous fighters in middleweight history when it comes to the ground game. And there's literally videos of Khabib out-grappling Luke Rockhold. That should never happen. What does Leon Edwards compare to that? If Khabib could do it, I can imagine Islam can do it as well, especially when you're scaling Islam to Khabib. And if he could potentially do that to Luke Rockhold, I'm pretty sure he could do that to Leon Edwards, adding more size to him. And do we foresee a decline in Colby Covington? He says he wants to get back in there. He wants to fight. He wants Wonder Boy. If he gets Wonder Boy, I think he can win. But if he fights the same way, Wonder Boy can knock him out. But if Colby returns back to peak form, I think he should absolutely beat Wonder Boy, hold him down as long as he wants. So this all comes down to, was ring rust an actual thing, and was it a permanent effect on him? That's what this all comes down to. But at his age, he's like 35 years old or something, has been dropped several times in his career. I have a feeling he's just not in it anymore. Do you guys have that same feeling? Like Colby's just not mentally in it as much anymore, like competitively. When you see certain fighters, you're able to feel some kind of like hunger out of them. Like there's a fire lit under them. There used to be something like that with Colby before. Especially when he was going up against Usman. Walking to the cage, he looked like he was low energy. He didn't sprint inside the cage like he usually does. Colby looked like he had low energy, besides from the press conference. And it could be the age. It could be that he's been making so much money that he just wants to make enough more and then bounce. And he probably sees that in himself, and that's why he wants Wonder Boy and not Shavkat. Because Shavkat has that fire lit under him, man. He's a young guy chasing legacy. Wonder Boy's old, he wants fun fights, he wants to go up against strikers and put on good performances, and it's an easier matchup for Colby Covington. I wouldn't be too surprised if Colby wants to retire soon. I agree with Chill's son in a way, because Chill said the same thing, but Chill said we won't see Colby ever again. I think Colby wants a couple fights out there to make as much money as he can, and then he'll retire. That's what I see from Colby right now. And then we go to Mike Griffith. Love the channel, keep up the good work. Who do you think is the best boxer in the UFC? My top 4 would be Conor McGregor, Jorge Masvidal, Adesanya, and Dustin Poirier. I would say Adesanya is number 1, but being a good boxer is mostly about hitting and not getting hit. And Conor is the best at that. So I would say Conor is the best boxer, but you're the expert, you tell me. I don't like calling myself that, but in terms of best boxer in MMA, it's very hard to say who's the best at any aspect, especially when you're talking about striking, like who's the best striker, who's the best boxer, who's the best wrestler. There's so many different variables that will throw a fighter's game off compared to somebody else, right? There could be an amazing boxer in MMA, but he has such bad takedown defense, he's never able to show his boxing skill. But he might be the best boxer if it stands up, you know what I'm saying? So like, there are different variables in MMA that just throws off opponents' ability to box, kickbox, wrestle, etc., you know? But just to make it fun, I would say out of those 4, prime Conor McGregor is the best boxer. I'm talking about the Conor we saw against Eddie Alvarez. I'm talking about the Conor that we saw in the second Dustin fight. Hear me out here. I know some of you guys might think that's a crazy take. The Conor McGregor that fought Dustin in the second fight, when he came out boxing, that was the best boxing form of Conor McGregor. Not fighter, but just boxing. I've never seen Conor box that well in a fight before. But the leg kicks did him in, you know? So he came out so one-dimensional. He did throw some high kicks here and there, but he came out extremely one-dimensional to the point that even someone like Dustin, who's not necessarily a good kicker, was beating him because of leg kicks. And remember, that's the fight that Dustin even said that Conor rocked him to a point that if he followed up after that left overhand feint to the leaping right uppercut, if Conor followed up on that, he probably would have finished Dustin. This is the same guy who was outboxing Dustin Poirier. Nobody outboxes Dustin Poirier, and Conor was in that second fight. So that's why I do believe in pure boxing, Conor, if he wants to be. But Dustin is a better MMA fighter. That's just the big difference between the two. If Conor's coming out more karate and throwing out more kicks, Dustin has proved to be a better boxer in that kind of fight. But if Conor comes out focusing on his own boxing, then he's going to be the better boxer between him and Dustin. But he'll lose the fight because of light kicks, takedowns, etc. The second best boxer, I say, is Dustin Poirier. He's a guy that has some of the most success with the shift combo. He has a great counter jab, great boxing defense overall, good Philly shell, good cross guard. His barrage when he has the opponent cornered is some of the most effective because he's not just trying to brawl it out and knock you out recklessly. He's somewhat technical there as well, picking his shots. After that, I would say it's Adesanya. I think he's had more monumental success with his boxing compared to Jorge. The way he knocked out Robert Whittaker, the way he knocked out Paulo Costa, the way he was able to drop Whittaker in the first round of their second fight. He does a lot of great stuff out there, but he does have a lot of holes too that Sean Strickland definitely exposed. Actually, I'm kind of questioning that. Why put Adesanya above Strickland in this order here, right? If you put in Strickland, who's got some of the best boxing, especially defense, he would definitely be up there. I'd probably put Strickland above Jorge and Adesanya in terms of boxing. But considering the four that you didn't mention, I put Adesanya above Jorge. He does have mistakes where he leaves himself open, especially off the back foot counter. He doesn't do too well against jabs. This was shown against four completely different styles. Robert Whittaker's darting jab was getting to him. Jan was able to stick him with the jab even though he was much slower. Pereira was able to land from range, kind of go back and forth with Adesanya, reach in and hop behind the jabs afterward. Strickland was able to line up the jab of pure pressure and timing. And even with his own offense, Adesanya does leave himself open, but he gets away because of his reach and speed advantage over most of his opponents. So it's a lot of attributes that he's actually relying on for some of his defenses rather than pure skill, where guys like Dustin and Strickland, for an example, don't necessarily do. They rely completely on their defensive technique. And then Jorge, I would have last out of these four. He does some good stuff out there, but drops his hands a lot, man. He doesn't do well against a simple 1-2, but he does have some good, respectable offensive skill. And then your second question. Up to this date, we still have no idea who will headline UFC 300. I don't know why, but I have a bad feeling that Dana might put Adesanya versus Pereira for the 205 title. Don't get me wrong, Adesanya versus Pereira 205 is a massive fight, but we all want Conor versus Chandler. What are your thoughts? Do you think there's a probability that Dana might do Adesanya versus Pereira, or you still think it's Conor versus Chandler? I'm starting to think Conor versus Chandler is probably not going to be it, even though that should be it. That's the fight the vast majority of fans want to see, of course, with Conor involved over Pereira and Adesanya. I like Pereira versus Adesanya always. I don't think that fight will ever be boring. I think people will still love to see that fight, regardless how many times it happens. But now that Pereira is hinting at his next fight, it looks like it might be Tom Aspinall. Is Tom Aspinall versus Alex Pereira worthy enough to headline UFC 300? You know what? With all the other fights that are announced, with so many champions not available to headline that card, Aspinall versus Pereira might be the best title fight you could put together, but I do think Adesanya versus Pereira is still a bigger fight pay-per-view wise, just because of how big of a star Adesanya is and how much people love the competition between them two. They're 1-1 in MMA, 3-1 overall. There's still a storyline between them two, and Adesanya keeps talking about how he beat that guy once. He's literally posting stuff like that. He's posted multiple times on social media reminding people that he beat Pereira before. So there is still a rivalry between these two that I think a lot of fans will love to see. But I agree with you that Conor versus Chandler is the fight to make for that card. And then we go to John Jordan. Hi, I was recently at a party where two guys with zero fighting experience decided to throw down to settle a dispute. Before they fought, each were hyped up and given advice on what to do. It made me think, what corner advice would Weasle give to someone who's just an average, untrained guy who's going into a fight for the first time? Assume the fight is inevitable, and both guys are comparable in size and have virtually no fight experience. What key bits of knowledge would you try to impart as he heads into his first scrap? Now, you're not talking about sport, you're talking about an actual fight, which changes it a bit. Well, first, I would say don't fight. If you could avoid this, avoid it. There's no sense of settling a dispute like this by throwing down on the street because you never know what could happen. Someone could come up behind you and now you're jumped 3-on-1. You cannot expect a fair fight on the street these days. Those old days are long gone, man. It's a lot more dangerous. People will come out with weapons. So avoid it at all costs. If you could avoid it, avoid it. It's not worth it, especially if you got a family, especially if you got kids. You got to think of the bigger picture here. God forbid, if you were to get deleted out there, what happens to your kids? What happens to your wife? But in your scenario, you're saying it's an inevitable fight. So for the guy I'm cornering, first thing I would tell him is scout out the environment. You gotta know for sure he has no friends around. Look where everybody's positioned, look where everybody's standing. Take notice of how people are looking at you. If people are noticing you, if people are giving you that certain kind of look, like we were expecting you kind of look, you know he's got friends around. And probably avoid this fight. But let's say it's 1-on-1, an inevitable fight. I gotta tell him the very basics because off of that alone, he should win. I'll show him a good stance to keep. If he's right-handed, bring the right hand back, left foot and hand forward, and extend the jab. Always throw out this jab. Just like line up the right hand. That alone is going to win him the striking. Don't throw any kicks. Focus just on your hands and keep your hands up at all times and never look away from your opponent. That could be pretty hard early on because naturally when punches get thrown at you, you want to look away. So try to keep your eyes on them, focus, extend the jab constantly, and keep your hands up at all times even after you throw the jab. And don't lose your stance. Always keep your left foot forward, right foot back, and whenever you think you can land your power right hand, throw that after your jab. So that's going to win him the majority of fights standing. But also, if the guy bum rushes you, I gotta show this guy a double leg. We're on the street and you have to win. If he bum rushes you, go for the takedown. You gotta use your strength in this scenario because by the lone fact that you get this position of a double, just physically because the guy's the same size as you, you could pick him up and slam him on the concrete. You gotta do it. This is not a sport. This is not a game. This is not competition. You gotta get him before he can get you. And if slamming his head on concrete is the way to do it, you gotta do it. And if you're not skilled enough to use like jiu-jitsu to hold the guy down and stuff, slamming him on concrete is the way to end the fight. So that would be my advice. I know it could seem kind of brutal, but fighting on the street is not a game. That is always life and death, which is why I always advise everybody to not get into fights. Because if you don't have that mentality, if you cannot get into a fight thinking life and death, you should not be in it because the guy who's fighting you is thinking that way. And that's why he's going to bring friends. That's why he's going to bring weapons. That's why he's going to bring all this stuff because that's what comes with this. Fighting is a very serious thing. But great question, man. Then we go to the public questions. We're going to start with the worst box. As the year ended, which division do you think is the most exciting and least exciting? It would be great if you ranked all of them. And personally, flyweight has been looking crazy. Thanks for the great year of videos, man. No problem, man. Thank you so much. I've been trying to keep a lot busier with the content. So I'm so grateful you enjoy it, man. Most exciting division to the least exciting division. Now, this is just my opinion. Lightweight is the most exciting, then bantamweight, then featherweight, then middleweight, which is crazy. You know, if you asked me a year ago, I would not have said middleweight at all. It would be like on the lower end of my list. Then flyweight, then welterweight, then light heavyweight, welterweight, strawweight, heavyweight, and finally women's flyweight and women's bantamweight in that order. I would say strawweight and heavyweight are somewhat comparable in terms of like excitement. I like strawweight more than heavyweight because a lot of those heavyweights are not fun to watch, man. Like just like the top end of them are. Whereas in the strawweight division, you have Lupi Godinez at number 11, Tabitha Ricci at number 12. Like these fighters are not boring to watch sometimes. Amanda Ribas is fun to watch. She's number 9. Marina Rodriguez is number 7. She's pretty fun to watch. You have Jessica Andrade, Amanda Lemos, Tatiana Suarez, Carla Esparza, Zhang Weili. I don't find Yan Xiaonan too interesting. You know, just subjective just for me. I don't find her too exciting to watch. Nobody from number 8 to number 15 at heavyweight is fun to watch. Besides Derek Lewis and Ty, if they could get some kind of knockout. If they can't get that knockout, you know those fights are super lackluster. I don't like seeing a lack of technique at that level. When you're that low level in technique, I kind of check out a lot of times, man. I'm not gonna lie. Just if Lewis can find that knockout, that's when he's exciting. Let me see what some of you guys like. Another view likes flyweight. Another guy says welterweight is boring. Another guy says light heavyweight is low-key stacking up. Yeah, I agree. Light heavyweight's looking much better now. Remember like a couple of years ago where light heavyweight was like the deadest division in the UFC? Look where it is now. Crazy what Alex Pereira could bring it to a weight class. But there's other fighters there too, you know, Prochazka, Jamal Hill, you know, Khalil Roundtree, you know, there's some really fun guys in that weight class. There would have Nathan Gorman. Thoughts on Colby comparing Leon's dad to, crazy I can't even say his name, the guy with the mustache, and doubling down on his post-fight press conference comments on Leon's dad referring him to a criminal, saying he ruined many people's lives, so why would he feel sorry for Leon or apologize? I don't know much about Leon's dad. I did hear something about like a criminal life and stuff. I don't know necessarily what he did though. I know they said that he got shot and it was a dispute over money or something like that. Usually when that stuff happens, there usually is crime involved. But that comparison to the German guy with the mustache, yo, when can we say stuff? You know what I'm saying? Like, when can this, like, I gotta skirt around some words like that. That's so crazy, man. But yeah, the German guy with the mustache, we'll just call him. Comparing him to that is crazy. How does that even go? Did he do the same thing that we just didn't hear about it? Did they have another event like that in England that nobody knows about? Did he try to conquer all of Europe? Did he start a war? Like, what's the comparison? I don't know the comparison other than Colby saying both guys are bad. But just saying both guys are bad are not good enough to say that they're like similar or something. Some guy cut me off on the road once. Probably not a good person. He's comparable to Mao. I would never say that. It's just inaccurate. It's just low IQ to say. Can you say Leon's dad was a bad person and then just say how bad of a person he is? Yeah, that's fair ground. If he was actually that bad of a person, then yeah, of course. If he actually ruined many people's lives and did the stuff that Colby says he did, then of course, yeah, it's fair grounds to call out people when they do something bad. And it really comes down to the person. So what do you guys think? Just morally or philosophically, even if the guy passed away and he was, let's just say hypothetically, he was a horrible person when he was alive. Is it off grounds to talk bad about that person? I guess it points to the question of how bad of a person do they have to be, where then you can start speaking ill of the dead. You know what I'm saying? And then we go to Ravi Rolls. Islam versus Shavkat, Shavkat versus Hamza, Hamza versus Bo Nickel. Break it down, please. Now, with Shavkat, it's hard to say whether he could stop Islam's takedowns because nobody shoots on this guy. So just how we just found out that he's not the best takedown artist, especially shooting for takedowns. Shavkat seems a bit better in the clinch and tripping you out and stuff, but he is not the best at just generally getting it to the ground. But once he does get you down, he's a huge issue. So I don't know exactly where his takedown defense is. He's a big, strong guy. He's bigger than Islam, of course. If I trust that his grappling offense can transition to his grappling defense, I would pick Shavkat. I think on the feet, he can also beat Islam as well. I think the stand-up could be rather competitive, but I would pick Shavkat if it stands up long enough. Shavkat versus Hamzat. I trust Shavkat to win this over Hamzat. Mainly for the fact that Hamzat slows down. He's done it multiple times already. But that first round is going to be quite difficult for Shavkat. And again, we don't know how great his takedown defense is. If it's lights out takedown defense, Hamzat's in trouble, right? Because I think Shavkat will outstrike Hamza Chimaev. Hamzat is plotting. He also doesn't move his head just like Shavkat doesn't. Shavkat has more tools to work with. He is a much better kicker. I think he's more skilled with his boxing, more technical. But Hamzat is probably a better pure puncher than Shavkat. He probably generates more power. He probably is more precise with what he throws. They both have a very good jab, but Shavkat uses that jab in different kind of ways. He can use it moving backwards, he can use it moving forward, whereas Hamzat's is a little bit more rudimentary compared to Shavkat. So I would go with Shavkat right now, but we still have to know more about his takedown defense. Then Hamzat versus Bo Nickel, I got Hamzat. It's way too soon for Bo Nickel. Hamza stuffs the takedowns. He might take Bo Nickel down. He's too dangerous on the ground. I think too dangerous in the stand-up. He's more experienced. If he takes Bo Nickel down, Bo Nickel's going to be in a lot of trouble. I can see Bo giving up his back. Hamza gets his back and chokes him out. Right? Bo Nickel is so new to MMA. I can only imagine he still has the same wrestling instincts if he gets taken down. Get into his base, and there's a choke ready for Hamza. Then we go to John Wan. How good was Abdulmanap, and what will his legacy be in 10 years? Will his grappling style become the most dominant in the UFC? There's a lot of fans already saying that it's the most dominant grappling style in the UFC. I don't think you really argue against it at this point. The Dagestani wrestling style, it's a thing for a reason. It's a problem that these fighters have to address for a reason. There's a reason why some of these fighters want to train with some of these Dagestanis. And not only in MMA, I mean, these guys have been doing very well in wrestling for a very long time. Even all these American wrestlers have been saying the same thing. Henry Cejudo said he went to Dagestan, I think. He was barely able to do anything against these guys. DC's been talking about the Dagestanis for a long time as well. And so I think Yoel Romero also. In fact, DC said there's this Dagestani wrestler that he fought back in the day, if he transitioned to MMA, he would even beat John Jones. That's what Cormier was saying. Hajimurov Gasalov is the guy that DC was talking about. It was a guy he wrestled back in the day, and DC said this guy would have beaten everybody if he came to MMA. I don't know if that guy is Dagestani. I know he wrestled for Russia, for the Olympics, of course. Probably for the region. I know he wrestled for Russia. He wrestled for Armenia when Russia was banned from international competition. That guy apparently was a monster. I need to do more research on his matches. I haven't watched really any of them. But apparently that guy was insane. He won the gold medal of the 2004 Olympics. He was a 5-time world champion. 2005, 2006, 2007, 2009, and 2013. He won silver in 2010 and bronze in 2014. 3-time European champion. 2-time bronze medalist in the European Championships. He was 5'10". He used to wrestle at 212 pounds and 276 pounds. So apparently this guy was such a beast that DC believes that he would have beaten John Jones. So the way those Russians wrestled, man, it just changed the game. And DC said, along with Gasulov, all these other Dagestanis and Chechens and all these guys that have the same kind of wrestling style used to dominate in wrestling before they came to MMA. And he just knew by the time they would come to MMA, it'd be a problem for a lot of fighters, and it turned out to be true. From a small region of the world, with such a low population, they amassed world champions, top contenders in multiple divisions. It's quite insane the success of that region has had in this sport. So how good was Abdulmanap as a coach? He had to have been amazing with all the great fighters that he was able to help bring up. Khabib, his son, of course, Islam Makhachev, Umar Nurmagomedov. I don't know how much he's helped DC and Kane and those other guys at AKA, but he's a fantastic grappling coach. Fantastic. And it seems like he's pretty intelligent when he talks about other fighters. Then we go to Madara Uchiha. I feel like Khabib and Islam have underrated speed and movement on the feet. Is this because of their extensive combat sambo careers, hence making them veterans of MMA fighting before they even entered the UFC? Considering combat sambo that Islam and Khabib did is similar to MMA, yes. So combat sambo is like the closest form of MMA. You just have the gi on, you have the top on. So you throw punches, you throw kicks, you can grapple, submit, take people down, do all that kind of stuff. And there's very few amount of sports out there that are grasping that same element of MMA. So it was a natural transition from combat sambo to MMA. And it's not like it's because of just the Russians, right? If combat sambo was big in America, or big in England, or big in Brazil, or big in any of these other countries, they would have a similar kind of production of these kind of fighters that naturally transition to MMA. They don't feel out of their element. And they could go into MMA a lot sooner in their lives. They have a sport over there, a martial art, that gets them ready for MMA. Obviously not intentionally, but that's how it worked out. It's like the same guys that used to fight back in the day in Vale Tudo, over there in Brazil. Guys like Vanderlei Silva, right? Those Vale Tudo guys were able to transition into MMA after competing in Vale Tudo, which is very similar, or Pancration, like Bas Rutten for an example. And that's why Khabib and Islam have this kind of underrated speed and movement and everything they kind of do out there. They see things a lot more clearly than the other fighters do. They understand movements a lot clearer so they can react quicker, right? They can counter it a lot faster. They have so much experience in fighting. A lot of the other MMA fighters don't necessarily have the same kind of thing. They might have a big head start compared to these other MMA fighters that come from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu originally, or wrestling originally, or kickboxing, whatever it is. Khabib and Islam, they started with Sambo, which has a lot of different forms of grappling into one, and then went into combat Sambo, which is pretty much MMA, and then went to MMA. If any other country was doing this, they probably would be able to produce a similar kind of fighter. Then we get to the next question. You mentioned how much history you know. How much of the Rashidun Caliphate do you know of? From 632 to 661, and Arab blitzkrieg into the modern era Middle East and North Africa with conquest at lightning speed for the time. Generals like Khalid and Umar. So a history question, I'll put this at the end of the podcast. Then we get to Colin Theisen. Hey Weasle, been really enjoying you putting out more content recently. Where does the name come from? Weasle seems like a weird name to pick since it's usually got some kind of negative association with it. Either way though, man, the extra content recently has been treating us well. Thank you so much, man. It's a very cringe kind of reason. I made this channel when I was very, very young. I saw a picture one day that was really funny. It was a funny picture of a weasel, and I wanted to make a YouTube channel just to use and comment because I used to comment on UFC videos for years before I made content. So I just wanted a channel. I named it that after seeing that picture, and that was it. And in the beginning, when I started making content, I wanted to change the name, but it took off so quickly that I didn't have time to change it because people are already knowing me as Weasle MMA. Okay, well, I guess I'll stick with the name. I got really no choice. If I just change it all of a sudden, people would be confused. Then with the King Louis. What are your thoughts on Leon Edwards saying that neither Belal or Shavkat deserve a title shot? Is Leon becoming the champion he used to hate? Yeah, seems so. I did make a video about Leon kind of going down this road. He was the guy that Belal Muhammad is right now. Wasn't finishing fights, long win streak. Not a lot of people thought he was exciting. He used to talk a lot about how he deserves a title shot and stuff like that. He's done the work and he deserves a shot. Now Belal is in a similar kind of position and he says Belal doesn't deserve it. He's literally the guy that he used to hate on back in the day. To say that Belal and Shavkat don't deserve a title shot, how could he say that? It really doesn't make much sense. He's not even a big enough of a star in order to demand this kind of thing. To say that these guys don't deserve it and then he's going to look at someone else. Because I think he's talking about Islam, right? He's talking about Islam going up to middleweight. Like, Leon is becoming more unlikable as a champion as time goes on. And then last question, we're going to go to Pep Guard. Before we get into the history section, a lot of people have trashed Strickland for attacking DDP, but the wife of Gilbert Burns said on Twitter, it was DDP who said he wanted to fight Strickland. Thoughts? Does it change your thoughts on Strickland being the aggressor, but was egged on by Dricus? Plus, is this proof DDP is in Strickland's head with the dad comment? This is interesting, yeah, so I saw Burns' wife say that DDP wanted Strickland to fight him. Let's say we take her for her word. I still don't think you should fight him, right? I don't think that's enough to get into a fight with somebody just because they want to fight you and they're egging you on to do it. But Strickland is not a stoic figure. He never was. I don't know where this whole narrative came from that Sean Strickland was stoic and emotionless. The guy has been unhinged for so long. It's not confusing that he would attack DDP. Of course he would. I would be shocked if he didn't. Now, I don't think they should have gotten into a fight. I don't think that should happen. Imagine he cut open Dricus because he was throwing elbows at him, right? Imagine he cut Dricus open and the fight gets canceled. Imagine one of them got arrested. So Strickland in a way was the aggressor physically. So I would say Strickland, yeah, he was the aggressor of the two because he physically attacked him. Dricus was just talking trash, right? Dricus was kind of just playing mind games with Strickland, going into this whole mental warfare thing. And does that prove that DDP is in Strickland's head? Yeah. He absolutely is. Even Strickland admitted so. Is that always the best thing you want to do? Probably not. There are some times where guys fight better when you're in their head. Conor was in Khabib's head. That didn't turn out too well for Conor. Khabib went and attacked his corner afterward because Dylan Dennis was also in his head. I mean, imagine preparing for Conor McGregor, fighting him for 4 rounds, all this buildup, all this stuff, and then after the fight is over, you remember what Dylan Dennis said about you. Immediately when the fight is over, you're like, oh yeah, Dennis said some trash about me too. I'm gonna attack him. Look how Cody Garbrandt competed against Dominic Cruz when Dominic Cruz got into his head. Look at Leon Edwards. Leon Edwards did not fight reckless like we thought he probably would have. Then you have guys like Jose Aldo, Eddie Alvarez, maybe even Dustin Poirier the first time he fought Conor McGregor, Chael Sonnen, and maybe Anderson Silva for the first fight. Like, there are times where fighters don't compete as well because of the mind games, right? Eddie Alvarez even said his game plan was to kick and move to the left. But I forgot if he said it was the environment, the buildup, or it was like Conor's trash talk that got to his head so much that Eddie started boxing and moving to his right instead. So he started to do the opposite of his game plan, and he noticed it after the fight. So yes, Dricus is in Strickland's head for sure, but I wonder what an angry Sean Strickland fights like. Because if we get sparring Sean Strickland out there, it might be too dangerous for Dricus. The mythical fighter sparring Sean Strickland would like magically possess knockout power all of a sudden. For real though, I don't know how Strickland is going to fight Dricus. I don't know if he's going to get super aggressive. I don't know if he's going to be more focused. He's got some time, right? The fight is a month away, so maybe he becomes more level-headed, but then again, there's going to be more press conferences, more interviews. Dricus is probably going to talk even more about Strickland. Strickland's going to be talking about Dricus as well. It's a fun fight, man. This is going to be exciting. Okay, one more question. I see this question, Joe Eagle. If Gaethje is next for Islam, what does Charles do? Does he want a young lion like Arman or a big name super fight? How do you see a potential fight between the beloved Charles and the hated Colby playing out? Similar height and reach, Colby might have 5 to 7 pounds on him on fight night. Charles versus Arman would probably be the next fight to make. It's a good #1 contender fight, but then there is a big fight with Colby Covington to be had that could potentially headline a pay-per-view, but I don't know how much Colby's star power has plummeted from that loss. I do think Oliveira beats Colby. They're not too different in size. Colby's like an inch taller in height, I think. They have about the same reach. Oliveira hits much harder. He's much more dangerous on the ground. He could potentially stuff some of the takedowns as well. And the more Colby scrambles with him, the more he tries to chain wrestle, the more in danger he's going to be of those submissions. So the way that Colby wrestles, I think it's actually worse against submission artists like Oliveira because you give him so many angles and opportunities to work with. So I definitely would say that Charles would beat Colby Covington on the feet and on the ground. Colby doesn't have much for Charles on the feet. Charles is so precise with what he throws. Colby's like awkwardness and his chaotic punches would not be a problem for Charles to counter. And if we get this version of Colby Covington that just fought Leon Edwards, that fight gets finished in the first round probably. And now a history segment. We have a question about history. And this is regarding the Rashidun Caliphate, which was, I believe, the first caliphate after Muhammad. And yes, it has a lot to do with religion. So I'm not going to get into the religious parts of it. I'm not going to talk about anything like that. The only thing is I don't want to get religious. I don't want to get political on here, as the Rashidun Caliphate had a big thing to do with the expansion of Islam, but not looking at the religious part of it, just looking at the warriors, looking at the battles and everything like that. The Rashidun Caliphate was a big fight against the Byzantine Empire, which was one of the most powerful empires at the time. And Umar, I believe, was the second successor to Muhammad, and he was historically winning battles in record time. This is what all the historians agree on, and a large part of that was because he had a warrior like Khalid next to him. According to a lot of historians, Khalid was an absolute powerhouse on the battlefield, one of the most feared warriors at the time. I still kind of question that he was undefeated for that many battles. They're saying like he was over 200-0 or something like that, which is insane. I know a lot of that was against different tribes in the Middle East and stuff, but the guy was sent all over the place to win battles. It was a giant conquest back in the day. I do know that Khalid specifically was a notable warrior during the time who apparently never lost a single battle during the whole thing. The Rashidun Caliphate, I do know it had a big religious aspect to it, of course. It was a big conquest or like expansion of Islam. It was like to be the succession of Muhammad after 632. I think Umar was one of his successors. I don't know if he was like the second or third successor, as the first one passed away very soon after he was elected the leader. And was it Umar who actually did the big expansion on the Byzantine Empire? Because back in the day, the Byzantine Empire was one of the most powerful empires at the time. And during the Rashidun Caliphate, they were able to expand into almost taking out the entire Byzantine Empire. I know mostly about like the most feared warriors of the time, Khalid was used so often, going here, going there, take over that place, take over this place, conquesting throughout so many of these regions. He invaded the Sasanian Empire. They almost took that completely over in like 4 months or whatever it was, winning battle after battle in record time, literally weeks in between each other. He would win one battle, then the next, then the next. Then they threw him into Syria, which he crossed the Syrian desert, by the way, to get there. Instead of going through Mesopotamia, which I think that's where he was at originally, he could have just went right to Syria from there. He went through the Syrian desert, which was not advised for him. Nobody would be advised to do that. The Battle of Yarmouk was such a big battle in history because of the odds. The entire army was given to Khalid. They were greatly outnumbered. Some say like 7-1. I've heard 10-1. I don't know if I believe that one. I think the most one you're going to hear is a 7-1 or 5-1 against Khalid. And they defeated the Byzantine Empire, which lasted like a week. Because of the success from Khalid, he was given to decide their conquests in the future. That's where I'm going to stop here. Then we get to Jerusalem, and I don't want to get into like the whole modern stuff going on right now. I don't want to bring up all the recent politics and stuff. I'm talking about just historical warriors back in the day. Very interesting to read. Not talking about like the religion necessarily, or not talking about the politics and stuff. And then they eventually did go into Egypt. So off of what I know, I don't know like the most about the Rashidun Caliphate, but off of what I know, especially from Khalid's side, I just read more about him specifically. Very interesting stuff. That guy was a genius of a general. What did they say his record was in battle? Like, how many battles did he win? It was like 200 wins in battles and 0 losses or something crazy. The guy's like the Charlie Zilnov of history. And finally, with history, I want to end on 4 warriors regarded as the champions of Christ. One of them, you guys know him, probably would never expect him to be regarded as such, but Dracula, or historically Vlad the Impaler, was one of the champions of Christ. You had Stephen the Great, Can Hunyadi, and Jiri Castrioti. These 4 warriors were holding back the Ottoman Empire for so long, especially Jiri Castrioti, who was like the front line against them for 20 plus years. And you have to know that the Ottoman Empire was like the America of today. They were the most powerful empire in the world on pursuit of conquest. Can Hunyadi was from Hungary, Stephen the Great was from Moldavia, Vlad the Impaler was from Wallachia, and Jiri Castrioti was from Albania. It's another reason why I know so much about this period in time. This also was quite of a religious war as well, which I'm not going to get into too much because the Pope was heavily involved, especially with Jiri Castrioti. He was trying to help him. He was going to launch like the next crusade, so I'm not going to get into that whole thing. But that was one of the battles I had mentioned before in another podcast, the Battle of Kruja of 1450. If you want to look it up, it's Kruje for Jiri Castrioti. He had some insane battle tactics. The reason why he had a goat helmet, number one, he was goated. Even his enemy, the Ottoman Empire, respected him to such high regard. They said when he passed away due to illness, Europe lost its sword and shield. That's what the very Sultan of the Ottoman Empire said about him. And not only that, his nickname was Skenderbeg. Skenderbeg translates to Lord Alexander. The reason why the Ottomans called him that was because they compared him to Alexander the Great. Historically, he may have been the greatest warrior at the time, as both allies and enemies respected him to such high regard. But the reason why he does have the goat helmet, they say it's because one of his battle tactics, he would ride out goats during nighttime at the enemy, and he would have candles on their horns to make it look like there was a huge army approaching them. If you put candles on goats' heads from that far away, each goat, it looks like there's 2 people charging at them. He was extremely good with guerrilla warfare, very good on the front line as well, but unfortunately, he was backstabbed all over the place. There were a lot of people who were turning against him, even his own family. And his own very family were turning against him. Just because the Ottoman Empire was so powerful, they didn't want to be involved in this war. Albania, Moldavia, Wallachia, and Hungary were quite small in comparison. There were a lot of people just giving up and surrendering. I'll probably get more into the Champions of Christ on the podcast because there's just so much to talk about. There's way too many things between these 4 generals. Vlad the Impaler was obviously the most twisted out of them. He was a strange one. The reason why people believe in Dracula was because people believed he was actually like a monster. There's legend that he would feast upon his enemies' bodies, and he would have like a forest of impaled soldiers. I believe he was also backstabbed, but for another reason. Some people say that he wasn't as bad of a leader as they painted him, but then there were some that said that he was absolutely evil to his own people. Stephen the Great was trying to make things work. Stephen the Great tried to work with Vlad the Impaler. I want to get a lot more into him on the podcast because he is very much unknown. He's actually, I think, the most unknown out of all these four. And then, of course, you had Can Hunyadi. Can Hunyadi put on a valiant effort. I don't know necessarily if his own people backstabbed him, but I know the countries around him that he thought were supposed to be against the Ottoman Empire, they surrendered to them. There was a lot of backstabbing from those countries against him, and Jesh Kastrioti wanted to team up with Can Hunyadi. That wasn't able to work out because there were other countries around that weren't allowing Kastrioti through, which really hindered the resistance against such a big campaign toward Italy. And that is ultimately the end of the podcast, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to give this a like, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I'll see you guys in the next video.